The moment an HOA guard tells you to apologize before you can enter your own property, you learn a lot about power, and even more about paperwork. The first thing I noticed that night wasn't the guards. It was the chain. Thick steel links stretched across my front gate, still bright and clean like they'd been installed only hours earlier. My headlights washed over the metal, and the reflection flashed back into my eyes, sharp and cold. I slowed the truck to a stop about 10 feet from the gate, gravel crunching under the tires the way it always had since my grandfather poured that driveway in 1974. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. Then the beam of a flashlight hit my windshield. One of the HOA guards stepped forward from the shadows like he'd been waiting there all night. The radio on his shoulder crackled softly. He didn't look nervous. He looked rehearsed. "Evening," he said through the glass, voice calm in that official tone security companies love to teach their employees. "You'll need to stop right there." I glanced past him at the chain again. My gate. My property. My land. Locked. "Problem?" I asked. He lifted the flashlight a little higher, so it lit my face instead of the windshield. Behind him stood another guard, arms folded, leaning against the brand-new keypad box someone had mounted beside the fence post. That box definitely hadn't been there yesterday morning. The first guard shifted his stance and said something that made me blink once, slowly. "You can come in," he said, "after you apologize to Mrs. Halston." For a second I thought I'd misheard him. I killed the engine. The quiet settled over the road like fog. No wind. No traffic. Just the faint hum of insects and the soft buzz of their radio. "Apologize," I repeated. The guard nodded like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Yes, sir." HOA directive. I looked past him again at the chain stretched across the gate, and then over to the right where the fence post stood under the security light. That's when I saw it. The small metal survey marker embedded in the ground beside the post. The same marker I'd photographed 2 days earlier when I noticed fresh paint on the gate column. Funny how little details start to matter when someone decides to block your way. Home. I stepped out of the truck. The night air carried the faint smell of fresh paint and cut grass from somewhere down the road. My boots crunched against the gravel as I walked toward the chain. The second guard straightened a little. "Sir," he said, polite but firm, "you'll need to stay back." I stopped about 6 feet from the gate. Close enough to see the brand stamped into the chain links. Close enough to read the tiny serial number printed on the keypad box they'd installed. I nodded slowly like I understood everything. "So let me get this straight," I said. "I apologized to Karen, and then I'm allowed to enter my own driveway." The first guard shrugged slightly. "Those are the instructions." Behind him, the keypad light blinked green for a moment and then went dark again. Someone had programmed it recently. That much was obvious. I slipped my phone from my pocket and casually turned it in my hand. Not recording yet. Not necessary. Not tonight. Because the truth is, when people are this confident, they usually make the mistake for you. I looked up at the guard again and gave him a small nod. "All right," I said calmly. "Let's see how this plays out." What none of them realized in that quiet little cul-de-sac at exactly 11:58 p.m. was that locking that gate might be the most expensive decision their HOA president had ever made. I leaned against the side of my truck and let the silence stretch for a few seconds. The guards stood where they were, confident, patient, like men who believed they were doing exactly what they were paid to do. The beam from the security light above the gate hummed softly, throwing long shadows across the gravel. My gate had always looked different at night. The iron bars cast thin black lines across the driveway, and the cedar fence beside it carried the faint smell of fresh stain every summer. My grandfather installed that gate the same year he finished the house, back when this stretch of land was nothing but open pasture and 2 gravel roads. 50 acres then. About 47 now after the county widened the road 15 years ago. Still more than enough space to breathe. That was the whole reason I bought the place back from my uncle 2 months ago. I had spent the last decade working contracts across 3 states, living out of hotels and temporary rentals, chasing projects that always seemed to end just when you started to feel settled. When the chance came to return here, to the one place that always felt solid under my boots, I took it. Quiet land. 1 long driveway. 1 gate at the entrance, and a house sitting about 400 yards back under a line of oak trees. No HOA when my grandfather lived here. That came later when the developers bought the surrounding ranch land and carved it into neat little half-acre lots with matching mailboxes and neighborhood newsletters. The subdivision wrapped around my property like a horseshoe, but the driveway itself never belonged to them. That detail mattered more than most people realized. The first guard cleared his throat. "Sir, I just need a yes or no," he said politely. "Are you willing to apologize to Mrs. Halston tonight?" The way he said her name carried that careful respect employees use when they are talking about someone who signs their checks. I studied his uniform for a second. Gray shirt, security badge stitched above the pocket. The company name printed along the shoulder in blue letters. Iron Watch Protective Services. I had noticed that same logo earlier in the week on a white SUV parked near the clubhouse entrance down the road. It was interesting seeing it here now. Standing in front of my gate like this had always been their post. The second guard shifted his weight against the keypad box and folded his arms tighter. "We do not make the rules," he added. "We just enforce them." I nodded slowly. That sentence carried a lot of history in America. The keypad blinked green again for a moment and then dimmed. Someone had installed the wiring cleanly. Professional work, probably done during daylight hours when most people were at work. I glanced down at the ground beside the fence post where the little brass survey marker sat half buried in the dirt. A square inch of metal most drivers would never notice when they rolled past the gate. But survey markers tell stories if you know how to read them. That one told me exactly where the property line ran, exactly where the HOA jurisdiction ended, and exactly how far the authority of Mrs. Brenda Halston actually reached. The guard watched me looking at the ground. "Everything all right?" he asked. I looked back up and gave him the same calm smile I used with difficult clients back when I worked commercial construction bids. "Everything is perfect," I said. "I was just thinking about how interesting tonight is going to become." The first guard frowned slightly, unsure whether that was sarcasm or surrender. "So is that an apology?" he asked. I slipped my phone into my pocket again and shook my head once. "No," I said quietly. "That is patience." Then I stepped back toward my truck and glanced down the road toward the glowing streetlights of the subdivision where Karen Brenda Halston lived in her 2-story brick house with the perfectly trimmed hedges and the HOA president plaque mounted beside her mailbox. She believed tonight was about respect. What she did not realize yet was that tonight was about jurisdiction. I opened the truck door and sat down behind the wheel again, leaving the door cracked so the cool night air drifted in. The guards watched me carefully now, the way people do when they cannot quite decide whether someone is about to argue or simply wait them out. The engine was still warm under the hood, ticking softly like a metronome counting seconds. I did not rush. Time has a funny way of changing situations when the other side believes they are already in control. The first guard stepped a little closer to the chain. "Sir, we are not trying to cause trouble," he said in a calmer tone. "Mrs. Halston just wants a simple apology so the community can move forward." I almost smiled at that sentence. Community. It was a word people liked to use when they wanted to pretend private authority worked the same way as public law. I looked through the windshield toward the long stretch of driveway disappearing behind the locked gate. 400 yards of gravel curved gently through oak trees before reaching the house. Even in the dark, I could picture the place clearly. The old porch light hanging above the front steps. The weathered swing my grandfather built from cedar boards. The metal wind chime that always rang whenever the evening breeze rolled down from the hills. I had spent half my childhood summers running up and down that driveway with a fishing pole in my hand and dust on my boots. Nobody had ever stopped me at that gate before tonight. I reached over and turned the key halfway, so the truck radio came alive with a faint whisper of country music before I turned the volume all the way down. Then I leaned my arm on the window frame and looked back at the two guards. "Out of curiosity," I said, keeping my voice relaxed, "who exactly told you to lock that gate tonight?" The first guard hesitated for half a second. Not long, but long enough to show he knew the answer mattered. "Mrs. Halston," he replied finally. "She is the Homeowners Association president." I nodded once as if that explained everything. "Did she mention who owns the gate?" The second guard answered that one quickly. "It is part of the subdivision entrance." I tilted my head slightly and glanced again at the survey marker near the fence post. That tiny square of brass reflected the security light like a small coin in the dirt. People rarely notice property markers unless they have spent time around survey maps and county records. I had spent quite a bit of time with both during the last 2 months. Buying land always looks simple on paper until you start reading the fine print buried in county plats and easement diagrams. That was how I discovered something interesting about this road. Something that explained why the original developer had drawn the property boundaries in such an unusual shape 30 years ago. The first guard shifted again and checked his watch. "Sir, we cannot keep this gate closed all night," he said. "If you just apologize, we can resolve this in about 10 seconds. I leaned forward slightly and rested both hands on the steering wheel. 10 seconds, I repeated thoughtfully. Then I looked past them toward the quiet subdivision street where porch lights glowed in neat rows behind trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes. Somewhere down there, Karen Brenda Halston was probably sitting comfortably in her living room, believing the situation at the gate was already finished. She had issued an order. The guards had followed it. Eventually, I would apologize and drive home. That was the story she expected tonight to tell. I glanced back at the keypad mounted beside the gate and the fresh conduit running down the post, where someone had wired the system earlier that day. Then I looked directly at the first guard again. "You are right about one thing," I said calmly. "This situation will resolve itself pretty quickly." The guard relaxed a little at that. He probably thought I had finally decided to cooperate. What he did not realize was that I had just finished confirming the last detail I needed. I let the silence sit for a moment longer, then reached into the center console and pulled out the folded manila envelope that had been riding in my truck since the day I closed on the property. The paper inside had that stiff, slightly waxy feel county records always have, the kind printed on thick stock that survives decades in courthouse filing cabinets. I rested the envelope on the passenger seat without opening it yet. The guards were watching closely now, trying to decide whether this was the part where I argued or the part where I gave in. The first guard stepped closer to the chain again and said, "Sir, I really do recommend we resolve this peacefully." His tone had shifted from confident to cautious. That usually happens when people realize a conversation is moving somewhere they did not expect. I leaned my elbow out the open window and looked past him at the keypad box mounted beside the gate post. The tiny green indicator blinked again. Someone had wired it cleanly, but whoever did the installation had not bothered to ask a single important question first. "How long have you two been posted here tonight?" I asked. The second guard answered, "About an hour." I nodded slowly. "And in that hour, has anyone else tried to use this gate?" The first guard shook his head. "No, sir." That made sense. This driveway only led to one place, and I had been out of town most of the afternoon picking up supplies from a hardware store about 30 miles south. I tapped my fingers lightly against the truck door and looked down at the survey marker again. A single brass square stamped with numbers most people would never recognize. County survey crews place those markers with exact measurements that define where land ownership begins and ends. If you know how to read them, they are like mile markers on a legal map. The guard followed my gaze down to the dirt. "Something wrong with the ground?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "Not at all. Actually, it is exactly where it should be." I reached across the seat and finally opened the envelope, sliding one of the documents halfway out so the county seal caught the security light. I did not hand it to them yet. I just held it there where they could see the edge of the official stamp. Paperwork has a particular effect on situations like this. Raised voices make people defensive. Official documents make people careful. The first guard leaned slightly forward, curiosity starting to replace certainty. "What is that?" he asked. I slid the paper back into the envelope again before he could read the text. "Something the county clerk gave me about 6 weeks ago," I said calmly. Then I glanced back at the keypad box and the chain stretched across the gate. "You see, when I bought this land, I spent a lot of time at the courthouse studying the property plat maps. Old ranch land gets divided in interesting ways when developers start building subdivisions around it. Roads move, boundaries shift, easements get drawn in unusual shapes." The second guard frowned a little. "I am not really following you," he admitted. I smiled slightly. "That is all right. Most people would not." I leaned forward again and rested both hands on the steering wheel. The truck headlights still illuminated the chain and the keypad box clearly. Fresh installation, clean wiring, brand new lock. All of it sitting about 3 feet inside the wrong side of that survey marker. I looked back at the first guard and asked one more question in the same calm tone. "When Mrs. Halston told you to lock this gate tonight, did she happen to mention anything about county easements?" The guard blinked once. "No, sir." I nodded again and looked down the road toward the quiet subdivision, houses glowing under streetlights. Somewhere down there, Karen Brenda Halston was probably feeling very satisfied with how the evening had unfolded so far. Orders given. Authority enforced. One stubborn landowner waiting outside his own gate until he learned some respect. I rested my arm back on the window frame and let out a slow breath. That is interesting, I said quietly, because the county definitely did mention it to me. The first guard glanced down at the brass survey marker again like he was seeing it for the first time. The security light above the gate hummed softly, casting a pale circle across the dirt and gravel around the fence post. For a moment nobody said anything. That silence told me something important. Neither of them had been briefed about property lines. They had simply been given instructions. Lock the gate. Wait for the apology. Problem solved. That is usually how these situations start. Orders come from someone confident enough that nobody bothers to check the details. The first guard cleared his throat and shifted his flashlight toward the ground where the marker sat half-buried beside the post. Sir, he said slowly, I am not really sure what a county easement has to do with this gate. I nodded once like the question made perfect sense. That is fair, I said. Most people do not spend their evenings reading county plat maps. I leaned over and tapped the manila envelope resting on the passenger seat. When I bought this land, the county survey office gave me a full boundary report. 42 pages. Every measurement down to the inch. They even walked the property with me and showed me where every marker was set. The second guard tilted his head slightly. And that one is important, he asked. I pointed casually toward the square of brass in the dirt. That one is extremely important. The wind shifted slightly and carried the faint smell of cedar from the fence line. The old wood always held that scent after sunset when the air cooled down. I had smelled that same scent 1,000 times growing up here. It was funny how familiar places can suddenly feel different when someone decides they control the entrance. I rested my forearm on the door again and looked straight at the chain stretched across the gate. You see, that marker tells a very simple story, I said calmly. Everything on this side of it belongs to me. I paused for a second and then nodded toward the keypad box mounted on the post. And everything on that side of it belongs to the county road easement. The guards exchanged a quick glance. I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads. Easement was not a word security companies liked to hear when they were enforcing private authority. Easements mean public access. They mean legal corridors where private rules do not always apply. The first guard rubbed the back of his neck slightly and looked toward the chain again. I was told this gate was part of the subdivision entrance, he said carefully. I gave a small shrug. That is probably what Mrs. Halston believes. The guard shifted his weight again and studied the keypad box like it had suddenly become suspicious. Are you saying the gate is not allowed to be here? I let the question hang for a moment before answering. No, I said slowly. The gate itself is perfectly legal. Then I lifted my hand and pointed at the chain running through it. The lock is the problem. Both guards looked up at me at the same time now. I could see the confidence fading out of their posture little by little. Because once you place a lock across an easement that guarantees property access, I continued calmly, you are no longer enforcing homeowners association rules. I tapped the envelope again and smiled slightly. You are interfering with a recorded access right filed with the county clerk 30 years ago. The second guard blinked slowly. You mean like a legal access road? I nodded once. Exactly like that. The radio on the first guard's shoulder crackled softly again. Somewhere down the street, another security unit was probably checking in with dispatch. The guard glanced down at the survey marker one more time, and then back at me. Mrs. Halston did not mention anything about that. I looked down the road toward the quiet line of houses again, where the homeowners association president was probably finishing her evening tea. No, I said quietly. Something tells me she did not read the plat map. The first guard slowly let out a breath and rubbed his chin while staring at the chain stretched across the gate like it had suddenly turned into a legal document instead of a piece of metal. The security light buzzed overhead, and the green indicator on the keypad blinked again, steady and indifferent to the conversation unfolding beneath it. I stayed exactly where I was with my arm resting on the truck window, giving them time to think. When people begin to question an order, the silence does half the work for you. The second guard shifted away from the fence post and walked 2 slow steps toward the survey marker in the dirt. He crouched slightly and shined his flashlight directly on it. The beam reflected off the brass square, and the stamped numbers became easier to see. Survey markers always look unimpressive until someone realizes they represent the exact point where legal authority changes. So this marker, he said slowly, this is the actual property boundary. I nodded once. Yes. He looked back at the chain and then at the keypad mounted on the post. And the easement runs across the entrance road. Exactly, I said. The first guard exhaled quietly and glanced down the road toward the subdivision lights like he was mentally replaying the instructions he had been given earlier that evening. Orders are easy to follow when everything appears straightforward. They become complicated when you realize a detail was missing. Mrs. Halston told us the entrance road belonged to the homeowners association, he said. She said you were refusing to cooperate with community standards. I gave a small shrug. She probably believes that. The guard stared at the chain again. I could almost see the calculation happening in his head. Security companies train their staff to avoid situations that could turn into legal problems. Nobody working a night shift wants to explain to a supervisor why they blocked access to a recorded easement. The radio on his shoulder crackled softly again, and a voice somewhere in the distance asked for a routine status check. He pressed the button and answered automatically. Unit 3 at the entrance gate. Situation stable. Stable was a generous description of what was actually happening. The second guard stood back up and brushed a little dust from his pant leg while keeping his flashlight pointed toward the ground. If this is a county easement, he said slowly, then technically the access road cannot be restricted. I nodded again. You are catching on quickly. He looked back toward the keypad box and the chain like they were suddenly much heavier than they had seemed an hour earlier. We were told to wait for an apology before letting you pass, he said. I leaned slightly forward and folded my hands on the steering wheel. That part is still accurate. The first guard frowned a little. But if the road is protected access... He stopped mid-sentence and looked toward the survey marker again. That was the moment the realization settled in. Orders from a homeowners association president carry weight inside a neighborhood. They carry much less weight when they collide with county records filed decades earlier. I tilted my head slightly and studied both of them. Neither looked hostile anymore. They looked cautious. That was a much healthier place for the conversation to be. Let me ask you something, I said calmly. Before you locked that chain tonight, did either of you check the county plat map for this property? The first guard slowly shook his head. No. I gave a quiet nod and tapped the manila envelope on the seat again. That is understandable, I said. Because if you had looked at it, you would have seen something very interesting about where that gate post is sitting. The second guard looked down at the survey marker again. The security light flickered slightly above us. What would we have seen, he asked. I smiled faintly and glanced once more toward the quiet street, where Karen Brenda Halston believed her authority extended all the way to my front door. You would have seen, I said evenly, that this gate does not belong to the homeowners association at all. The words hung in the air for a moment after I said them. The first guard blinked slowly like his brain was trying to rearrange everything he had been told earlier that evening. The second guard turned his flashlight back toward the gate post, following the line from the keypad box down to the ground where the survey marker sat quietly in the dirt. A lot of expensive problems begin with someone assuming a fence line means ownership. Property law does not work that way. I reached over and pulled the document from the envelope just far enough this time that the county seal was fully visible in the security light. The raised stamp caught the glow and cast a small shadow across the page. Paper like that carries weight in a conversation even before anyone reads the words printed on it. The first guard leaned slightly closer, careful not to cross the chain. What exactly does that paper say, he asked. I held the document steady for a moment before answering. It says the access corridor for this driveway was recorded as a permanent ingress easement in 1993 when the original ranch was divided. I tapped the corner of the page lightly with one finger. It also says that the gate structure itself was installed on the Caldwell parcel, not on subdivision property. The second guard slowly straightened up and looked from the paper to the fence post again. So the homeowners association never owned the gate. Correct, I said calmly. They never owned the road either. The quiet hum of the security light seemed louder for a second after that sentence. The first guard shifted his stance and rested both hands on his belt, staring at the chain like it had suddenly become the most complicated object he had ever seen. Mrs. Halston said this entrance served the neighborhood, he said. I nodded slightly. It does. Then I pointed down the gravel road behind the gate. but serving a neighborhood and belonging to it are two very different things. The second guard rubbed the back of his neck slowly and glanced down the road again toward the subdivision, houses glowing under their porch lights. Somewhere in one of those houses, Karen Brenda Halston was probably expecting a message any minute confirming that the situation at the gate had been handled. The first guard finally spoke again. "If the gate belongs to your property," he said carefully, "then the homeowners association does not have authority to lock it." I gave him a small approving nod. "You are arriving at the same conclusion the county survey office did." The guard's radio crackled again, and another unit asked if everything was clear at the entrance. He hesitated for a second before answering this time. "Stand by," he said into the microphone. The hesitation was the interesting part. Orders had been simple an hour earlier. Now they required thought. The second guard looked down at the lock threaded through the chain and then back at me. "So what happens now?" he asked. I folded the document halfway back into the envelope and rested it on the seat again. The night air moved gently through the open truck window, carrying the faint scent of oak leaves from the trees along the driveway. For the first time since I pulled up to the gate, the situation had shifted away from stubborn authority and toward quiet realization. I looked at both guards and spoke in the same calm tone I had used all evening. "That depends on how quickly Mrs. Halston wants to correct a mistake." The first guard frowned slightly. "Mistake?" I nodded once and glanced toward the chain again. "Yes," I said evenly. "Because when someone locks a gate that they do not legally control, the county has a very specific term for that." The guard waited. The security light buzzed softly overhead while the keypad blinked green again beside the post. I looked directly at him and finished the sentence. "They call it obstruction of recorded access." The first guard repeated the phrase quietly, like he was testing how it sounded out loud. Obstruction of recorded access. The words seemed to settle into the gravel road between us. The security light above the gate buzzed softly, and the green indicator on the keypad blinked again, steady and indifferent, like the device itself had no idea it had just become the centerpiece of a legal problem. The second guard looked at the chain again, and then slowly reached down with his flashlight, following the metal links all the way to the lock threaded through the gate. It was a brand new lock, shiny chrome, probably installed earlier that afternoon. Somebody had gone through a lot of effort to make this entrance look official. The keypad, the conduit wiring, the lock, the chain, all of it placed carefully in the exact wrong spot. The first guard shifted his stance and glanced toward the quiet row of houses down the subdivision road. From here, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Porch lights glowing warm yellow. A couple of televisions flickering behind curtains. Somewhere inside one of those houses, Karen Brenda Halston was probably expecting a message telling her the problem at the gate had been handled. The guard rested one hand on his radio but did not press the button yet. Instead, he looked back at me and asked the question people always ask once the ground shifts under a situation. "Is that a serious violation?" I leaned my elbow on the window frame and looked calmly at the chain again. "It depends on how long the obstruction stays in place," I said. The guard waited. The night air moved through the oak trees along the driveway, and the wind chime hanging somewhere near the house rang faintly in the distance. That quiet sound had always carried down the gravel road when the air cooled after sunset. I had heard it 1,000 times growing up here. Tonight it sounded like confirmation. I looked back at the guard. "When access to a recorded easement is blocked," I continued slowly, "the county usually treats it as interference with property rights." The second guard stood up straight now, his flashlight dropping slightly as he absorbed that sentence. "And that is something the homeowners association can get in trouble for." I gave a small shrug. Sometimes the homeowners association. Sometimes the individual who ordered it. The first guard finally pressed a button on his radio. "Dispatch," he said carefully. "Can you contact Mrs. Halston and ask her to come to the entrance gate?" There was a short pause before the voice on the other end answered with a casual acknowledgement. The guard released the button and looked back at me again. The confidence he had earlier was gone now. In its place was the cautious expression of someone realizing a situation had just grown larger than the instructions they were given. A few minutes passed in silence. The keypad blinked again. The chain swayed slightly in the night breeze. Down the street, headlights appeared and began moving slowly toward the gate. A white SUV rolled around the corner and stopped behind the guards. The driver door opened and Karen Brenda Halston stepped out wearing a neatly pressed jacket and the same composed expression she probably used during every homeowners association meeting. She looked first at the guards, then at the locked chain, and finally at me sitting calmly in the truck. "I assume the apology is ready," she said with quiet satisfaction. The first guard did not answer immediately. He glanced once at the survey marker in the dirt beside the gate post, and then back at her. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "we may need to discuss the property line before anything else happens tonight." Brenda Halston stood beside her white SUV with her arms folded like she was already bored with the conversation. The porch light from the nearest subdivision house caught the side of her face and reflected off the polished badge pinned to the front of her jacket that read HOA President in neat silver letters. She looked from the guard to the chain, and then to me sitting calmly behind the wheel of my truck. "I believe I asked for a simple apology," she said in the same smooth tone people use when they assume the outcome is already decided. The first guard shifted his weight slightly and pointed his flashlight toward the ground beside the gate post. "Ma'am, there is a survey marker right here." Brenda glanced down at the brass square for half a second like it was a pebble someone forgot to sweep away. "Yes," she said impatiently. "I am aware there is land out here." The guard cleared his throat gently. "It marks the boundary line." That sentence made her pause for the first time. She looked down again, this time a little longer. Then she followed the beam of the flashlight up the post to the keypad box, and the chain threaded through the gate. Her eyes moved slowly back toward me. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. I leaned forward slightly and rested my hands on the steering wheel, the same calm posture I had kept all evening. The night air drifted through the open window, carrying the quiet rustle of oak leaves from the trees lining the driveway. "Nothing complicated," I said evenly. "Just something the county survey office confirmed when I bought the property." I tapped the manila envelope on the seat beside me and slid the document out again so the raised seal caught the security light. Brenda's eyes flicked to it immediately. Paper stamped by a county clerk has a way of cutting through neighborhood authority faster than any argument. "The gate structure sits on my parcel," I continued calmly, "and the road crossing the entrance is a recorded access easement filed with the county in 1993. Brenda's expression tightened slightly. "The homeowners association maintains this entrance." I gave a small nod. "Maintenance is not ownership." The second guard lowered his flashlight slowly and looked between us. The first guard spoke before Brenda could answer again. "Ma'am, if the road is protected by an easement, then locking the gate restricts legal access." Brenda stared at him for a moment like she was deciding whether to correct him or dismiss the entire conversation. Her confidence had not vanished yet, but it had begun to crack around the edges. "This property has always cooperated with neighborhood standards," she said. I shook my head slightly. "Actually, this property predates the neighborhood by almost 40 years. The wind chime near the house rang faintly again somewhere down the driveway, the soft metallic sound drifting through the trees like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Brenda glanced toward the dark road behind the gate and then back. At the chain stretched across it. The guard followed her gaze and finally reached down toward the lock. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I recommend removing the chain until the property records are reviewed." Brenda hesitated just long enough to reveal she was calculating something new now. Authority is easy when nobody challenges it. It becomes complicated when a single document changes the ground beneath it. After a long second, she exhaled quietly and stepped back from the gate. The guard unlocked the chain and pulled it free from the metal bars. The gate swung open slowly with the familiar creak I remembered from childhood summers. I started the truck and rolled forward a few feet before stopping beside Brenda. She watched silently through the open window as the headlights illuminated the long gravel road leading back to the house. I gave her a polite nod before shifting the truck into gear. "Next time," I said calmly, "it is worth reading the plat map first." Then I drove through the gate toward the oak trees while the chain hung loosely against the fence behind me, and the quiet road that had always belonged to this land finally looked the way it was supposed to again.